Well, welcome everyone. Dr. David Oy is a research entomologist at the USDA Agricultural Research Service Center for Medical, Agricultural, and Veterinary Entomology located in Gainesville, Florida. He conducts research on integrated pest management strategies for imported fire ants and other invasive pest ants, including the Tawny crazy ant that he's going to talk about here this morning. Well, welcome, Dr. Oy. The floor is yours.
Okay, Dan, let me see if I can get this right. Am I on now?
Sure are.
We got you.
Okay.
You got to flip your slides around real quick, David. Go ahead and click where it says Display Settings.
Where's that here? Is that on the GoToWebinar box?
That's right up at the top of your PowerPoint.
Oh, I see it. Okay. And swap.
You got it.
Okay.
All right, perfect.
Okay. Okay, should I go?
Whenever you're ready.
Okay, I'm ready. All right, hello everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here and to talk to you this morning about two of my favorite friends, the fire ant and the Tawny crazy ant. Dan, I thank you for inviting me, and I haven't done one of these before, this webinar, so we'll see how it goes. I'll get started. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the biology and management of fire ants and Tawny crazy ants. What I first wanted to do was to speak a little bit to identification, like as with any IPM type program where you're trying to control some kind of pest. You want to make sure you know what you're controlling and you have the right target. So we'll look a little bit at the difference between red-ported fire ants and Tawny crazy ants and some other ants that might look like them. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the biology and control of red-ported fire ants. And lastly, talk about Tawny crazy ant biology and ways to perhaps improve its control. So, before I get started with the fire ant, one of the big reasons why fire ants, and many of you are probably familiar with this, it's such a big, I guess, issue, and why it's so, at least now worldwide, it's become such a concern because it's being found in other countries, is that it attacks a wide variety of things like wildlife. Here you see it attacking a young bird. It's a problem in pastures and rangeland. Here you have lots of nests in this pasture, indicating lots of fire ants there. And then, of course, it attacks crops. Here's some fire ants on okra. You'll girdle citrus trees. So again, it's a problem in a wide variety of habitats. It's a quarantine pest. This is in a nursery where it's a prime area for fire ants to infest these potted plants, and it's a good way if they can spread, and that's how they spread throughout the southern United States so quickly way back before they had a quarantine. But for us, most of it, the biggest problem with fire ants is that it's an urban pest and it stings. So we have here a picture of one of our technicians years ago. He stuck his hand into a fire ant nest just for this picture, and you can see he has some nasty little sting pustules here. You can see here fire ants can get inside buildings, and that can be a problem. And one of the big problems is that fire ants can cause people to have allergic reactions, and in fact cause some death. It's rare, but occasionally it does occur. Because of that, you have these lawsuits and settlements, and for example, here I'm mentioning one here. It cost almost $2 million. This is way back in 2005. But a lot of these things aren't publicized. They're confidential, so they can be a big cost. So there's been some surveys done for fire ant impacts, at least in the United States, maybe almost $6.5 billion per year on expenditures and damages caused by fire ants. So they're very big problems. One of the world's worst invasive ants. So to make sure we have fire ants that we're dealing with, you have to be able to distinguish between them. And in this case, since I'm talking about tawny crazy ants, I'll focus a little bit on that. So in this slide here, you see a tawny crazy ant on your left and the red-reported fire ant on your right. And if you look at them close up, it's pretty easy to tell that they're different. You know, the tawny crazy ant is a little lighter in color, more golden brown. The red-reported fire ant is reddish brown to black. And they're both classified as maybe small to medium, and people describe them as darkish ants. They kind of overlap. So if you look at them, the lower two pictures from further away, it's a little bit more difficult to tell them apart. I mean, if you have good eyes, you can still see them apart, but tell them apart, but they are kind of merging a little bit. So I wanted to just show you how we can distinguish fire ants and tawny crazy ants from some other ants that sometimes that look alike, that look like them. And these you might run into in your practice. So here we have the red-reported fire ant. These are all nice pinned or pointed specimens, so it's very easy to see all the characters. You have a tropical fire ant, closely related to fire ant. Then you have the big-headed ant. Then on the bottom half here, we have the Argentine ant, black pyramid ant, and tawny crazy ant. And I picked these ants here on the bottom because they'll oftentimes have similar large populations like the tawny crazy ant does. So anyways, let's first talk about the red-reported fire ant and how we can distinguish them from these other ants. So one of the first things we'll do is, and you can see this with your own naked eye just looking at ants. Notice the red-reported fire ant, the tropical fire ant, and the big-headed ant all have what we call two nodes between their abdomen here and their thorax. So the thorax here is a section which contains the legs, and their abdomen here is the back end. We also call it for ants the gaster. And you can see here that 1 and 2 nodes in each of these. As opposed to the ones on the bottom, you only have a single node like this, and sometimes the node's even hard to see, but it's there. This is probably a difficult angle to see it at. So that quickly separates at least the tawny crazy ant and these other ants from the fire ants. And then if you just want to distinguish the red-reported fire ant from these other 2 ants that kind of look like them, for the tropical fire ant and the red-reported fire ant, their antennae have a 3-segmented club. Here you kind of, I take like 2-segmented club, 1 here and 1 and the second one here. You can see that here and here. So the club is just an expanded portion at the end of the antennae. And the big-headed ant has a 3-segmented club. So you see this part here they're all pretty small and narrow, and then the club is 1, 2, and 3 bigger segments. So that's one way you can tell. And of course, you probably need a microscope, and you have to have the ant so that you can see it. The other distinguishing character for the big-headed ant is that it has a pair of spines on its thorax here on the back here. So it's a pair, and the tropical fire ant and the red-reported fire ant do not. So that's some morphological characters we look at. And so how do you separate these two? Because they're very closely related. They behave very similar. And one easy way is the tropical fire ant will have these major workers. So they have these worker ants that have these big heads like this. And the fire ants will generally just have the same size head that's in proportion to its body, just like the regular tropical fire ant worker here, but this is also a tropical fire ant. So if you see these major workers, then you know that you probably are dealing with a tropical fire ant. So looking from afar, I just wanted to show you that it's kind of relatively easy to see. So here's a major worker. It's actually a big major worker in a tropical fire ant colony here. You see all the young and the workers, and then look at the fire ants. You don't see something like this running around. They're all about, like as I mentioned, the head is about in proportion to their body. So that's some of the more, I guess, more fine detail way to tell these ants apart. And if you just want to look at the distinguishing characters in general for just the red-reported fire ant, and to kind of review what we just talked about, you have the 2 nodes between the gaster and the thorax, or the abdomen and the thorax. You have many different sized workers. So here's a bigger worker here and a smaller worker, but remember the heads are still in about the same proportion to their body. The antenna ends in a 2-segmented club. I can show it here. You can see that quite clearly. And then you have this medial clypeal tooth that I didn't mention. This is getting fairly technical, and I have it circled here. This is kind of hard. You have a little CT coming off or hair coming off it, but right at the base of that hair is a little tooth. And this one actually you can see a little bit better. You have these two teeth on the side and one right there. So that's really hard to tell, but that's one good way that we tell that red-reported fire ants from the tropical fire ant. But you'll probably never get to that level just out in the field. You have to have a microscope to do this. Another way that this is just a side here that I thought it'd be kind of interesting to show you. If you're an entomologist and you have all these ants in your laboratory, then you can do a little quick test like this and get yourself stung and see what kind of reaction you'll get. So here we have the southern fire ant, Solenopsis xyloni. Then we have the tropical fire ant, Solenopsis geminata, and the red-reported fire ant. The one we're concerned about here is a Solenopsis invicta. And going from right to left, they had stung. I think this is my arm, or could be my friend's. You have the xyloni here, then you have the geminata here, and the invicta down here. And this is after about 1 hour, and they all produce these little welts. So it's hard to distinguish from there. But if you wait almost a day or 22 hours in this case, you see that this red-reported fire ant, or Solenopsis invicta, has developed a white pustule on top, versus the tropical fire ant, or Solenopsis geminata, there's no pustule. You still have a little bump there, but it probably still itches, but you don't have this pustule. And here's xylonia again. It has a little bump, but none of this big white pustule here. So for some in the medical literature, this was designated as being diagnostic for Solenopsis invicta having this white pustule. So if by chance you're curious of what you're dealing with and you got stung, and you can look after after a day or two, you might be able to tell the difference that way. But again, I think that's something that we don't normally do. What we normally do is you see something like this. So you go out into the field or a yard, and you'll see, maybe if you're in the red clay of Georgia, or in this case it was Alabama, and this is happening to be a pasture, but this is a nice big mound. The red clay is easily seen, and it's a fire ant nest. Probably all of you can recognize that. In Florida or someplace more sandy soil, the nest is not as pronounced as the red clay, but it's still there. And especially after a rain and you had a chance to build it back up, you can see a nice little mound there. Oftentimes, if it gets dry, this will flatten out a little bit. It's a little more difficult to see. But then what do we do when we see a mound? We kick it open, and if the ants come running out, then you're pretty sure that's either the red-reported fire ant or the tropical fire ant. And they both have similar behaviors. As we mentioned, how you can tell the tropical fire ant apart, look for that big-headed soldier cast or major worker, and of course they will sting. So that's probably how we typically determine what it is. But the other steps we do is if someone just brings us a single sample, and it gets a little more complicated. Just to give you the newest update on some technology that's just been developed. This is from my colleague Stephen Vallis here at the Fire Ant Lab here in Gainesville, Florida. He's developed this fire ant identification kit. We call it a lateral immunoassay for invicta, but it's basically it's a pregnancy test to help detect red-reported fire ants. And this will be, it's called InvictiDetect, and it'll be marketed soon, probably in the beginning of November by AgDia. And I just thought I'd just show you this. Basically, if you have a red-reported fire ant and we squash it into the little cell thing here, produce 2 lines after 10 minutes, then you have a red-reported fire ant. If not, and just 1 line indicating that the test is working, but it's only 1 line, then you don't have a fire ant. And we'll probably, most of the, if you're a PMP, you probably won't be using something like this, but what they are going to probably use this for is for agricultural inspectors stations, where they'll check trucks and things like that. If they're trying to see if they're bringing commodities that have fire ants out of the quarantine area, they can use this. And then for other countries that have just are trying to eradicate fire ants, or just to see if they have fire ants in their in their country, or if they suspect it, this will come in handy because you don't have to have as much training to figure out which ants or if you have fire ants or not. So this is just some new technology I thought I'd just share with you folks right now. Okay, so that's a little bit on identification. Let's talk a little bit more about how we control fire ants and their biological, their biology and how that affects their control. Again, we're going back to their nest, and we just talked about this, and oftentimes, again, you see a nest, and if you kick it open and you open it and you maybe shovel, or like I said, kick it open, you'll see all these little, all the ants, adult ants running around with white things in their mouth, and the white things in their mouth are their brood or their young, and basically they're eggs, and here are some eggs here and some young, very small young larvae. These are a little bit larger larvae. It's a 4th instar larvae. This is which are much bigger, and then you have your pupae. Then it eventually turns to a darker pupae, which eventually turns into adult ants. So fire ants are have a complete metamorphosis, just like butterflies do. They go from egg to a larvae stage, then to a cocoon or a pupal type stage, and then to the adult. So you'll see this in a nest. You'll also see, of course, a bunch of workers. And for fire ants, you can have a range of worker sizes like this. The small ones maybe will tend to young more or take care of them. The bigger ones will maybe go out and look for food, things like that. Then you also have a queen. And I'll show you a close-up of a queen. This is a nice big fat queen, and a mature queen at her peak production maybe can lay 2,000 eggs per day. So that's quite productive, and that's part of the reason why when we're doing our control, we're always trying to target the queen, because if you don't get the queen, then the colony can recover. So you may kill lots of ants, but they'll hide her and protect her and move her to a different site, and they'll dig another nest, and then she can recover, and you'll still have fire ants in that area. So again, we're trying to target there. Now, there's 2 social forms of fire ants, and basically the difference when we talk about social forms is whether they have 1 queen per colony, or like here, or many queens per colony. We call that polygyne or monogyne. So in the single queen form, they're territorial, so the colonies or the ants will fight if they're from a different colony. So oftentimes, if you look at a field and the nests are far apart like this, it's a good chance that it's a single queen, because they've established this separation between the two, so they're not overlapping, and they'll forage in their own areas. They can have maybe 7 million ants per acre, and some of these colonies can be as big as 250,000 ants per colony. That's a very large mature colony. And then for this monogyne form, you have maybe 40 to 150 nests per acre, just depending on how mature those nests are. And we can distinguish single queens from a multiple queen colony using we call this marker for the general protein 9. I won't get into that too much, but that's very useful for research purposes to help us determine which kind of colonies we have. So in the multiple queen form, they're non-territorial. That's a key difference between the single queen form, so they won't fight among each other. And because of that, you can see that the nests will maybe be closer together. And they may have double amount of ants than a single queen form, so maybe 14 million ants per acre. The colonies can be twice as big, maybe 500,000 ants per colony. And then the nests per acre, the density is much higher, 200 to 800 nests per acre. Oftentimes they're smaller, but they're just closer together and smaller, as opposed to these can be much bigger and separated. Again, we talked about the GP9. And the predominant form of social form of fire ants in the U.S. is a single queen form. But in areas like in Texas, or states like in Texas, they predominantly have the multiple queen form there. So let's integrate a little bit, talk about their biology. What I'm going to try and do is talk about some biology aspects and how it affects its control. And so one of the first things when we're trying to, let's say, control fire ants, you have to know where they are and where to look for them if it's not obvious. So they like heat sinks, someplace that's warm, especially in the winter or in the fall where it's cool. So here you have a grave marker. It's cement, and it'll absorb heat and it'll give off heat while in the night while it's cooler. And so the ants have put their colony or made their mound or nest right next to the heat sink. And then they like these sunny open areas because fire ants, they like that warmth, not too hot, but they still like it warm, and so they'll thrive in these sunny areas. They also like moisture. They're originally from South America, and it's from a river basin down there, the Pontal, which floods regularly every year, and so they've evolved into being able to float. And so you'll see something like this. They're all kind of balled up, and they'll float until they reach a high ground or maybe a tree or some other structure, and then they'll disperse and try and regroup and start their colony there. You may have seen pictures of these on the website with Hurricane Harvey and even with Hurricane Irma here in Florida, where you will have something like these fire ants floating in the flooded areas, and they can be a real problem if they get into your boat that you're in. Another thing they like, fire ants like disturbed habitats, and such as this would be like a landscaped area where you dug up the ground, and when you do that, you maybe disturb some of the native ants there or the other ants or things there that may help impede fire ants from moving in. But once they're disturbed and they're stressed and they have moved out, then fire ants are real opportunists and they'll move into these areas. So oftentimes that's why you'll see in new developments you'll have in their new lawns after the site has been cleared and things, fire ants will establish there, and you'll have lots of fire ants in these new developments. So we often call them a weedy species in the sense that they will move into areas where you have where they can find some space. So they like a void, and if there's no ants there, if there are no fire ants there, they'll move into that area if it's a good sunny place for them. So if you know the preferred habitats, it'll help you pinpoint of where to treat or where to look for ants if you're trying to figure out where maybe a problem's coming from. So like this is a daycare center for kids. You have a grass playground, it's nice sunny open, they may be out there. Yeah, I don't show it here, but this site also had a planter box and the fire ants were inside there. They even had a nice fence, and if they did have some pest control treatment to try and keep the ants out of the playground area, right beyond the fence they may have fire ants there and they can move in. And that brings me to this point here. The nest of the fire ants, they'll move their colonies with the seasons to get the best climate for microhabitat for them. So and when it's really hot in the summer, they may be on the edge of the shade of a tree. So they'll catch some of that shade and it'll keep the temperatures more moderate for them. But in the winter, they'll move out more into a sunny area away from the tree and to get the full effect of the sun. What they don't like is heavily shaded areas, like deep inside a forest, or where they don't, they like it warm. And so maybe in a forest you won't find them there too much, but where you will find them is anywhere, perhaps you have a trail or on the edge. That's where they'll be, right on the edge where they're catching some of that sunlight. So one of the best ways, in my opinion, is to use ant baits to try and control fire ants, or in fact, any pest ant, because you're trying to target the queen. As we talked about, fire ants at least can lay 2,000 eggs per day at her best. But if you don't target the queen, the colony can recover. So with baits, what we're basically doing is we're using a toxic food, and we're actually presenting it to them like a gift. This cartoon here is like a Trojan horse. The ants will say, "Hey, this is something I can use. I'll take it into my nest and I'll take it down," and then you cause some havoc into their colony that way. So we're using a natural feeding behavior of ants to distribute the toxin or the insecticide to the colony. This is a trophallaxis Mike mentioned a little bit at the end of his talk. And here we have some dyed food, and this is in the laboratory. We have a big nest cell of fire ants, and this is blue dyed food, and so the worker ants here will go and feed on this, take it back to the nest, and feed their larvae and each other, the other workers. And you can maybe see a slight tinge there of blue. This is a close-up, and you can see this more clearly in their larvae. You can see how they have fed the larvae some of this dyed food, and then some of the pupae, as they change from larvae, or this pre-pupae that we call them, you can see some of their fat bodies are even dyed. So this is basically what we're trying to do with the bait. We're trying to get the ants to feed on the bait, take it back to the colony, and then so let the ants do the work of spreading the insecticide around to their colony. And I think that's a really efficient way to go. So the traditional components of fire ant bait, generally what fire ant baits are made out of, is you have your active ingredient, your insecticide. Generally, this is a slow-acting insecticide such that it gives a chance for the ants to feed on the bait and then take it back to their colonies, feed their other nest mates, spread it around, and then they start to die. So it has to have a little bit of a delay or act slowly. So basically, we'll take this active ingredient, we'll mix it into an oil attractant, generally soybean oil that's fairly cheap, and fire ants, they like the oily substances. They'll drink on that. Not all ants do that, but fire ants will. So now you have this poison oil, but that's hard to apply or distribute. So you take this poison oil and mix onto a corn grit carrier, and that makes it more granular. And that's just kind of what we're all familiar with, these granular ant baits. And so when we're trying to use ant baits, one of the key things is the weather. And basically, remember, we're trying to get the ants to feed on the bait. And so they have to be out and about looking for food. And so I often say, is it a good day or night to picnic? Fire ants will look for food or forage at night. So you want it above 7 degrees. You don't want it too cold. And you want it below 90. You don't want it too hot. So it's a nice time for picnic. You don't want any rain. Again, rain or irrigation at least 8 to 24 hours after application, because the corn grit that we use as a carrier will absorb that moisture and it will become less attractive for the fire ants. And some often say not immediately after a heavy rain, because after a heavy rain, or if their nest is flooded, they're going to be spending their time rebuilding their nest as opposed to going out looking for food. So if it's a big rain event, maybe wait a day or two. Another big factor of whether or not baits work is it fresh or is it rancid? Remember that oil. That oil can turn rancid if it's exposed to air and heat for a long time, or not even for a long time. If it's exposed to that, you'll start to go rancid. So a fresh bait would definitely be more attractive to ants. I open a bag and I can look at it. The bait particles generally will be loose, and they'll have this non-pungent, mild odor. As opposed to a rancid bait, the bait particles will be clumped. They'll be stuck together. You'll see some loose particles, but you also see some clumps in there. But the big telltale sign is it pungent? And I describe it as a latex paint odor. It really smells like paint. So you can kind of tell in saying, maybe this bait is no good. And just to illustrate that fact, here we have a colony of ants. This is some rancid bait, and this is some fresh or good bait here, and you can see they definitely prefer the fresh bait as opposed to rancid. And so, when we put out bait out in the outdoors, you're competing with other food sources. So you're competing with other dead insects or trash or food left on the ground from people, from us. And so if you're competing with you want to have something that's fresh and they like. It's just like us. We want fresh food. We don't want old food. So that's why it's so important. And oftentimes, people come to me and say, hey, the bait nut doesn't work. And I ask, if smell your bait, does it smell good? Is it fresh? And oftentimes that's the problem. And in fact, I've had bait where I bought brand new and I opened the bag and it's old and it's rancid. It's not good, and I had to return it. So let's talk a little bit about the active ingredients in baits. You have these metabolic inhibitors, as Mike mentioned earlier, and as well as nerve inhibitors, and we classified these basically on how fast they work against fire ants. So basically, it'll kill the adult in queens relatively right away. There's always a little bit of delay to allow them, as I said, to let them feed on it and take it back to the nest and spread it around. But then after that, it works. You'll kill the colony. Then you have a void where there's no ants there or no colonies there, and so new ants will start to move in. So that's the trade-off there with having this fast action. If it wipes out all the ants at one time real quickly. And then you have the insect growth regulator type active ingredients used in baits. And they basically affect the queen and colony reproduction. So they're not, directly killing the queen or the worker ants. And because of this, it's much slower action, and trade-off again, there's a slower reinfestation. They're small, declining colonies that will help keep other fire ants from coming in and developing. And there's some evidence that with these insect growth regulators, since they work so slow, they have better bait distribution in multiple queen populations. In other words, since these multiple queen colonies are not territorial, they'll spread the bait if they have a longer time to work with the bait to spread it around to more colonies. So let's get a little more specifics. The metabolic and nerve inhibiting active ingredients in fire ant bait products. Hydromethanol, it's such as Amdro or in probate, and it'll generally take maybe 2 to 4 weeks to knock out a colony. So it's not that fast, but it's faster than IGRs. You have some spinosage, and this is not as readily available, but in these products like Fertilome, come and get it. And there's, I think, Southern Egg has a product called Payback. And spinosage will work in maybe 1 to 4 weeks, so a little bit faster, but I think a little more inconsistent in terms of how well they work. You have a bait, Max Force FC, that contains fipronil, and that'll work similar to hydromethanol, maybe 2 to 4 weeks. And then you have the indoxacarb, which is in Advion, and in a retail product that's, I think, just come out this year, Ortho Fire Ant Killer Mound Bait. I think I got that right. But anyway, they both contain Advion, and this is probably one of the fastest of all the baits. It is the fastest of all the baits, maybe 3 to 7 days to take out a colony. So much faster than some of these other ones. And then probably most recently registered for fire ant baits is metaflumazone. This is in Siesta or Altravine. Again, relatively fast, 1 to 2 weeks. So the insect growth regulating baits, I'll go over this again on how they work. They cause this gradual colony death, maybe 2 to 6 months. And the reason for that is that adults, again, as I mentioned, do not die directly from the baiting itself. The adults workers just die naturally. They die of old age, so they'll hang around for a while. And then there are no replacement workers because the insect growth regulator has affected the queen or the larvae. And so what often happens is it'll cause a caste shift. So instead of producing worker ants like here, they'll just produce the sexuals, or the queens, or the males and a female here, alate that we call them. And so when they produce these are like the prince and the princesses of the colony. They don't do any work. And if you have no workers and no one's doing any work, the colony will eventually collapse because no one's going out looking for food, no one's rebuilding the tunnels, no one's taking care of the babies, and things like that. So that's why it takes so long. You just have to, as the workers die off naturally, the colony has nobody to take care of them, and eventually you'll collapse. And for some insect growth regulators or products will actually affect the ovaries, and they'll maybe not produce eggs. So some of the insect growth regulating type baits that we have, or in this case a queen sterilizing active ingredient, that would be the abamectin type baits in Award 2, Ascend, and Clinch. Again, this will take 6 to 8 weeks, and what this does is it actually sterilizes the queen. They have such a small amount of this of insecticide in there that she'll still be alive, but she won't lay any eggs. Then you have the insect growth regulators like juvenile homer mimics, the pyriproxyfen, in baits called Distance and Esteem. They'll take 6 or maybe 12 weeks plus to actually have the colonies go down. So again, you're waiting for the workers to die. And again, methoprene in the product called Extinguish. So these all work fairly well. So you may ask, okay, the IGR baits, they're slow acting, and why should we use them? And they cause this gradual colony death 2 to 6 months. But again, as I mentioned, they have this slow reinvasion of new colonies. Adult workers are still alive, and they will execute newly mated queens that can start new colonies. So I failed to mention this, but fire ants will have these mating flights, and the queens will mate with the males in the air, and they'll drop down, and those queens will start new colonies. So if they land into an area that's already occupied, those queens will be executed. That will slow down the invasion of new colonies. And so you have this slow death of a colony, and there'd be just smaller and smaller colonies, and you won't notice the ants as much. The other thing, as we mentioned, the slow worker mortality allows the bait to be distributed among polygyne colonies probably better, and that's the base of sometimes you hear about these skip swath treatments where they'll put out, this is more for agricultural use, they'll put out a swath of bait, and it'll skip a section, and they'll put another one, and that's because the ants can go between the two swaths, and that'll just save time on application. And the other thing that I didn't mention is a lot of these IGR baits are registered for use in crops, and so that makes it easier to use in a wider variety of situations. And even some of your yards, maybe your customers have fruit trees in their yards, so that might be something to consider. So that's the baits, and so I just want to talk real quickly a little bit about some of the other treatments. You have gingival mound treatments with insecticides, contact insecticides. This was done when fire ants first came to the U.S. They put these pretty toxic chemicals onto a mound. I guess this didn't show up here. But anyway, what I had here was a picture of a recent flyer from Alabama that lists retail products, and it listed 57 retail products labeled for actually treating individual mounds. So they're still very popular. They have various types of active ingredients, but to me they're difficult to control fire ants with individual mound treatments. That's basically, this is a nest, and the colony will move up and down the nest to get the best temperature, and then you apply the insecticide right on top, and it's hard to get to the queen because they'll hide and move her out to someplace else, and the colony will recover and escape from the mound treatment. So instead of that, they have things where they're just spraying the whole yard with insecticide, and there's many products that are listed there on the retail market. One product you're probably familiar with, the Fipronil product, the top choice, and they also call Taurus G. And the unique thing about this, it lasts a lot longer some of these other residual insecticides sprayed on yards. But then it's a restricted insecticide, and it's limited to one application per year, and it's also very expensive. And so one of the things about contact insecticides being sprayed over, let's say, a yard, these are surface spray, and they can repel ants, but it's only temporary. And when you think about it and you look at the colony, less than 10% of the fire ants are actually foraging above the ground at any one time. So that minimizes their contact with the insecticide. And again, it's difficult to contact and kill the queen. And then there's also some concern about when you just apply insecticides over large areas, and you can get contamination or it'll run off into waterways. So I think I'm going a little bit too slow here, so I'll just move a little bit more quickly. We talk about fire ant control lots. It's based on baits and insecticides, and so we have worked on other things for fire ant control, and this is bringing in classical biocontrol agents. These are self-sustaining. They spread naturally, and once we release them and they establish, they're free. We don't have to put any more inputs into it. And so some of the things we've worked on here at the lab over the years are fire ant pathogens like this Neohazeia stolonopsis and fire ant viruses. There are now 5 of them. And then we have this fire ant decapitating fly that I'm sure you folks are all familiar with. And so I think I didn't time myself too well, so I'll just briefly tell these are all very slow acting, and they won't take out a colony in your yard right away. So, but what it does do is help slow down the reinfestation of of the fire ants if they're out in the natural areas where you're not treating. So that's where we see the benefit there. So they're out there already, and they stress the fire ants, and hopefully they'll cause the fire ant populations in general be just a little bit lower, but you'll still have to treat areas which are heavily infested with fire ants. So I will skip now down real quickly, I'm sorry about this, to tawny crazy ants. So, the tawny crazy ant is non-dairyphobia. It's an invasive pest from South America, and it can cause big problems. It gets into electrical equipment, it causes short circuits, it inundates landscapes. So you have these huge populations as they're running over everything, and this is indication here where you have lots of dead ants, and then it negatively impacts the ecosystems because of their huge populations. And again, trying to distinguish them from fire ants, we talked about this, the one node. So the tawny crazy ant has one node, and then you have some other lookalikes. The Argentine ant and the black pyramid ant will have large populations. They all have one node. And so how you tell those apart? The Argentine ant will not have any hairs on its thorax here, as opposed to, say, the tawny crazy ant, and even this black pyramid ant have some hairs. You can't see them as well, but they will have it. And interestingly enough, the black pyramid ant has this little knob at the top of its thorax, only a single knob, and that's distinguishing for pyramid ants. There's several species, but they will all have this knob. So that's the big distinguishing character. And from these other ants, and tawny crazy ants, again, will have this pubescence, or they have dense hairs all over their body, especially on their head and on their thorax. Probably the easiest thing that you'll see, we were going to show this video, but I'll just try it here anyway. Let's see if this works. Oops.
David?
Yeah.
If you want to, you can go ahead and go in the control panel to that little drop down right below what should look like a pause button for you, and you can switch over to it. I think I called it Tawny Ants Trailing.
Right.
Tawny
So
Ants
where's that pause
trailing.
button that you're talking about?
It's at the top of the control panel. There's a little drop down menu right below it.
Not on the Go Webinar thing, right?
It sure is. That's where it is. It should be right up at the top underneath that tab called Sharing.
Tab called Sharing. Oh, I see it. Okay. All right. I don't see it here.
Here, just a second. I'll go ahead and get it going, and then I'll swap it right back over to you.
All right, thanks. What's going on here? All right, well, I hope you saw that. You saw the ants running around on the boardwalk there. This is from the Jacksonville Zoo, and that's typical of when you have these big population explosions. You have billions of ants running all over the ground. So when you see that, you know you have a problem, and some other ants may do that, but probably most do not do that like that. And so that's probably your best idea that you'll have a tawny crazy ant problem happening. So some of the distinguishing characteristics of the tawny crazy ant, as we talked, you have the one node, again, between the gaster and the thorax. All the workers are about the same size. The antennae do not end in a club, unlike the fire ants and some of those other ants. It's just straight here. And the head and thorax is covered with the dense pubescence or hairs. If you look closely, and you have this golden reddish brown color. Now there's another ant that looks very close to the tawny crazy ant. It's called Nylandaria pubens, and the worker ants are indistinguishable between each other, so we end up having to look at the males. So that's a little more, but most of us won't have that issue because the problem ant will be forward in these huge populations. The pubens don't have those big populations. The males you'll often find in the winter, you'll see these, or in the fall, and you have these alate flights. Often you'll find dead males underneath fluorescent lights, and you'll see them like this. And tawny craters are difficult to control because we don't have good baits for them. Commercial ant baits are either not foraged upon, or they don't cause enough death, or with these huge populations. And then we'll spray residual insecticides, become useless because they'll just die and they keep piling up on each other, and pretty soon you'll be walking over their dead bodies and they don't contact the insecticide anymore. So oftentimes we'll see sometimes they'll do something like this, and we'll just spray a landscape down at regular intervals, and that may give you some temporary suppression, but then again, very expensive and probably not the most efficient way to go. And so as a consequence, we have homeowners misapplying insecticides because they're so desperate to control them. And this is our friend here, Johnny Georges. He says this land here is toxic, and I've tried every pesticide known to man and nothing kills them. Well, he killed a lot of them, but they just still keep on coming, and this poor guy eventually moved out of his house, just couldn't take it anymore. So some of the example control products that we use for tawny crazy ants, or that are being used, you have the Terminor, it contains fipronil, and in Texas they have a section 18 which allows them to use it a little bit further out, 3 feet up and 10 feet out around a structure on sod though. And so if you're going to do this, you generally check your label in your state to make sure you're following the laws for your state. In the nursery, you have bifenthrin being applied to some of the pots, and these are actually fire ant quarantine treatments for that. There's some spot and yard applications with alpine, which contains dinoteffuron, and 2 baits that have had some attraction and some success is the advanced granular carpenter ant bait, which contains abamectin, and then this quantum, which contains imidacloprid, which is diluted in a sugar solution. So the ants will feed on it. Some will die, but it's probably definitely not controlling it. So part of the problem with tawny crazy ants, or why they're so difficult to control, is you don't realize you have a problem until it's too late. The nests are not noticeable like fire ants, and they're often very mobile. They'll move, they'll disappear one day, and they'll come up someplace else. And so you only notice when you have a huge population. And I have this analogy here: if you're trying to remove a full-grown tree, is much harder than trying to just remove a small weed or a small seedling. And that's the problem here, what we have with tawny crazy ants. It's such a huge population, it's very difficult to get a handle on it. And they end up nesting everywhere. They nest in yard debris. It's just some potted. It's a favorite place for me to collect ants. They'll be within pots laying on the ground. They'll be in yard debris. Oftentimes they'll be at the base of trees, and as you notice here, you can't see the nest very well. I pulled up some debris, and you can see some excavation of soil here, but they're there, and oftentimes they're tending aphids or scales in the tree, and this shows you the kind of interesting behavior. They'll sometimes protect these scale insects because they're trying to get the honeydew that these insects produce as a food source. They'll protect them with some covering. They'll put some debris over it, and you'll see something like this occasionally. Oftentimes we're in this type of situation. These are all dead tawny crazy ants, and basically they're just coming from across the fence into this wooded area, and you go further, there's this retention pond. So they like moisture. They like these areas with streams or water, and they like these wooded areas. They'll develop huge populations in there, and then they'll start moving out in the summer into this area. And that's where you end up having to try and control them, and oftentimes you don't have access to this stuff that's off the property. So that's where part of our problem is. So some of the recommendations for tawny crazy ant control include just removing harbors that serve as nesting sites, like yard debris and fallen limbs, and you try to minimize most habitat, like repairing leaks. Eliminate food sources if it's possible. This can be difficult, but if you have some small plants with lots of aphids or scales, you may try and control those to kind of reduce the honeydew production out on those plants. And if you have compost, pet food, and open garbage cans, maybe try and don't leave them out or seal them up if possible. And then again, I mentioned things that people have been doing, the area applications of insecticides, and then the perimeter applications around the structures, and these include both sprays or baits. And just to give you an indication of what's going on out there in the field, and they have this seasonal cycle. So we census about just 3 colonies once a month in Florida, and basically what's happening is in the fall and into the winter, the colonies are much smaller. There's less queens, there's less workers, and definitely less brood. And so what they're doing is they're congregating in the winter toward the base of trees. And there's a little bit of protection there, and there's some food source in the trees. There's some scales that are still left over that they can feed on from the honeydew. And then in the spring and into the summer, the population starts to increase, and that's where you start to have the problems. They'll start to move out from those localized areas around the tree bases or the preferred nesting sites, and they'll just spread out into the yard all over the place, and they have these small nests all over the place, and then that becomes very difficult to control. So looking at the seasonal cycle, we're trying to time that with our baiting efforts. So from some of these cycles, we say the queen and worker populations are lowest in September to December and begin growing from January to March. This is in Florida, so you probably have to adjust if you're up in Georgia or some other more northern areas. And then the brood production remains low from September to March. And this suggests the best time would be more in the cooler times in the winter, when again they kind of pull back into these what we call permanent nests near some harborage site. If you can locate them, and oftentimes they are at the base of trees and shrubbery, and you can treat that. And oftentimes what we're working on are liquid baits, and they kind of mimic the honeydew type of thing. So imidacloprid I mentioned, and also dinotefron and sugar solution are promising. So some of this, like the dinotefron, is still in the experimental stage, but we've seen good control in laboratory colonies, and that's not hard to do in the lab. But we do see field reductions, maybe up to 80% with some of the dinotefron baits, liquid baits that we're working with, and that's good that you can actually see the difference. 50% with billions of ants running around, you can't see the difference, but with 80% or even higher, you can notice that there are less ants in the area. So what we're trying to do is to try and figure out a way to perhaps dispense liquid baits more efficiently than just using stations, and that's a real significant challenge. So basically what I'm telling you here is, in terms of when you compare fire ants with the tawny crazy ant, we don't have the tools that we have with fire ants. It's much more difficult, and so we're still working on that. And so again, we have to learn a little bit more about their biology and things of that nature to get a better handle on them. So in that aspect, we're also looking at biocontrols for Nylanderia fulva, or the tawny crazy ant, and we have found the virus, and we also found another microsporidian pathogen, Myrmecomorba nylandria. And what's interesting that's noted in South America, and also we've seen it in Florida, and I think Texas is now beginning to see that we have these population crashes of these huge tawny crazy ant populations, and occur maybe every 10 years or so. So you have an area that's heavily infested, and next thing you know, they're gone. And we have several sites like that in Florida. We're not sure why. Perhaps these are pathogens, perhaps they're outstripping all their resources, but it's a very interesting phenomena. But while you're dealing, 10 years is a long time to wait if you're trying to control these ants. So we'll still have to work on ways to take care of them. And I'm sorry I went a little bit long, but to me, we try and control pest ants that are causing us problems, but at the same time, when we're studying them, they are really amazing, and we should appreciate them more sometimes. So with that, I think I'm done here.
All right, very good, David. A lot of good new information there on kind of on fire ants and crazy ants. I think especially for the folks here in Georgia and the Gulf Coast states, keep an eye out for that crazy ant. We did have a couple questions come in. I'll take a couple questions on fire ants and crazy ants, but I had a question here about somebody from North Carolina said that they're seeing fire ants move into North Carolina. Can you guess on, are fire ants moving further north? Did you see any progression further north? It kind of seems over the past several decades there's been kind of a hold on the movement of fire ants north. I know that Deanie, I think, had found them in Virginia.
Virginia, right?
Are you seeing them move any further north?
Yeah, we have seen that. I think North Carolina hasn't been, if I recall, it's not fully infested with fire ants, so they have areas to move into. And I know Tennessee, we've been tracking that because they have a big nursery industry there.
Mm-hmm.
And all the southern, I forgot how many years ago, maybe 10 years ago, all the southern counties were infested, and now it's moved much further than that. And so they are moving up, despite the quarantine that we have in place. You know, it could be, there's some speculation, you know, there's global warming, right? Things are a little bit warmer, or you have mild winters and the fire ants can establish, and if you have a hard winter, they'll be knocked back.
Yeah, I know that we had a pretty mild winter last year, and that one indicator species was here in Georgia. We had tremendous Asian cockroach problems.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
You know, little things like that. I had another question here about controlling fire ants in home lawns. How often would you recommend to treat a lawn for fire ants as a preventative treatment, and do you think Advion is a good choice for that?
So if you're going to use a bait, you can't really use it as a preventative because the ants have to be there to feed on it.
Mm.
So, but to me, if you know, if you see some fire ants out there and you apply the bait, it's a simple way to take care of your problem. It's really easy. If you just have a single mound, then you can just sprinkle some bait around it. If you have many mounds, then you can broadcast it out. You know, scatter it out, and they'll find it. Mm-hmm. And you can also use, you know, if you so desire, some of those contact insecticides, but they will not last forever. They'll maybe 1 or 2 months. And same with like it mentioned. If you have a bait and you take out all your fire ants, eventually some fire ants will move back in, and depending on how many fire ants are surrounding your area, you'll take them maybe 6 months or maybe 6 months, maybe a couple months to 6 months before you see the nest that's big enough to cause you concern.
Moving on to crazy ants here. I had a question here, David. This had to do with these huge drifts of ants. It's kind of a new thing for me to see here in Georgia. We've had them since 2013. I've got them in 6 counties here. But these huge drifts of dead ants that are deep, it seems that in some cases they're not associated with an insecticide treatment. Is there any truth to that? I mean, when you see these, we don't see this with Argentine ants. Of course, there's 3 times as many crazy ants as there are Argentine ants, but are the ants dying of starvation, or do you think most of that is insecticide related? Because it seems to me in some of these cases we're getting huge drifts of dead ants where, you know, maybe somebody's treated a long time before that, but it doesn't seem like in some cases it's insecticide related.
From what I've seen, lots of times they are insecticide related, and there's such huge amount of dead ants. They hang out there for a long time unless someone washes them away. They're just sitting there. Mm-hmm. When we do see these population crashes, we don't see those drifts of ants. They're just gone.
I see.
So.
Had another question. Don't have any more there on crazy ants unless somebody has another question, but we had a question. Somebody was talking about the, can you please dispel the myth about the grits?
Okay, yeah. So fire ants and ants in general, they generally do not actually ingest solid food. What they do is they'll let's say in this case the fire ant bait has a corn grit carrier. They'll take that grit, they'll carry it back to the nest, they'll suck out the oil, the liquid part, and then they'll spread it to the rest of their colony. Or that one of the larvae, the last stage larvae, the 4th instar, the biggest one, they'll place solid food, let's say a piece of insect or something, on its, what we call, anyway, by its mouth part, and they'll secrete some saliva or some kind of digestive juices on there that will liquefy that solid food, and then the ants will suck that up and spread it around to their colony. So they're always liquefying their food first. So the grits, they don't eat that and drink water and explode. That doesn't occur. Interesting enough, though, sometimes you'll see fire ants take in fire ant bait, they'll suck out all the oil, and then they'll take the empty grit and just pile it outside because they have no use for it, but they're not eating it.
Yeah, it's their junk pile. It's their junk pile.
Exactly.
Well, I think that's about going to do it, David. Fantastic, good information there on fire ants and crazy ants and insecticide mode of action as well, Mike. So we appreciate both of your time. I know it's a lot of hard work to put together a talk like this. Even if you've given the talk before, you still have to go back through it, and so we appreciate your time. And we had a good crowd this morning. Had almost 300 people online this morning, and I suspect, I know we had some folks from Canada. We may have had our friends from India. I think I saw the guy from Afghanistan was online, and we probably had numerous people from all over the southeastern U.S. So appreciate your time. Thanks everybody for attending, and hope to see you coming up in December for a 2-hour WDO presentation from Dr. Brian Forschler and Dr. Faith Oy on termites. So thanks everybody, and we'll see you around.
All right, thanks Dan.
Thanks David.